history is congested with governments that rank the value of its citizens based on those citizens' contribution to society. In doing so, these civilizations, either through superstition of worshiping a false god or by worshiping self and applying a selfish model of utilitarianism, favored certain people while discriminating against others. In other words, government rights throughout history were respected in those societies, and the rights of the individual subjugated to government. And in both instances, whether such action was taken in belief and worship of flawed gods or belief in and worship of flawed governments, the individual held little or no power. Hi, I'm Phill Klein. Welcome to First Principles, and we are continuing our discussion of ailments conflicting America. And today's focus is on the loss of the golden rule in our culture. This moral guidance gave birth to our legal concept of equal protection under the law. The claim that all Americans, regardless of creed or race or gender, have equal rights under the law. We can see the dramatic loss of this concept today in cancel culture. For who would want to be canceled from civil discourse or society based on one mistake? Who wants to live in a culture where we are not allowed to learn from our mistakes? And who is it that desires to allow for those in power to be the only arbiter of truth and what is accepted? Only those in power seek such a society. Allowing such an accumulation of power is always on the path of authoritarianism and tyranny. The concept of equal treatment under the law as applied to government is unique to the American experiment. But in America, it is now under dire threat by a secular moral relativism that proclaims that all truth is dead. Moral relativism's assault on truth is not new. It is as ancient as the first human being. And generally, history reflects these two competing worldviews in conflict. One view, that absolute truth is dead, and which views the individual as a victim of fate, or one which acknowledges a supreme author of absolute truth and recognizes one of those truths to be that all individuals are created by a loving God. Indulge me, if you would. And let's take a brief walk through history and the present and gain a better understanding of that which I'm trying to express. Let us begin with the small g gods of ancient Greece. Those gods held personalities and were much like us all the time. The Greek gods were always in conflict, fighting with each other for power and fighting each other and individuals for the adoration of humankind. These small g gods did not constrain their power to moral truths. Rather, they used power for power's sake and therein destroyed human hope. Individuals under the Greek pantheon were the pawns of the small g gods as the gods engaged in their galactic chess matches and battles. As a result, individuals were a victim of fate. In other words, there were not gods that they could rely on which they could place their faith, for there was no God of truth. The only truth in that universe is that the gods who designed that universe would be fighting each other for power, just as humans fought each other for power. The Greek small g god Cronus killed his father Uranus, and Cronus in turn was killed by his son Zeus. The gods repeatedly committed patricide, just as humans did in the famous Greek tragedy Oedipus. Yet the Greek gods committed their crimes intentionally. Cronus sought to kill his father, while the human being Oedipus did everything he could to avoid killing his father, but did so anyway. For gods without truth always make human beings victim of fate. In Oedipus, the Greek oracle at Delphi prophesied to Oedipus's father, King Laius, that his newborn son Oedipus would kill him and marry his mother, King Laius's wife. The king did everything to keep this from happening, as did Oedipus as he grew. Oedipus was sent away to be raised by another and kept from even knowing who his father was. But Oedipus's actions were fated by the gods and could not be changed based on any action of Oedipus or his father, at least the Greeks believed. And so as he grew into young adulthood, Oedipus came into conflict with a man he did not know was his father, slayed that man, his father, and then married that man's wife, whom he did not know, as his mother. When Oedipus eventually realized what he had done, he took his own sight by gouging out his own eyes. Man or individuals in the Greek pantheon could not see truth, touch truth, nor alter fate. Our culture today is analogous to this thinking. Our children are generally taught there is no truth, no absolutes, that all things are relative. Without faith in an author of truth, a big G God, Americans cast about for other gods to fill the void, but nothing satisfies that void. And Americans see the arbitrary nature of governance today and lose faith in government. Faith in Congress is at an all-time low. Faith in the executive branch and courts are low. This is to be expected in a world without truth, for truth is the foundation of hope, and government, not constrained by truth, is an arbitrary ruler. We see the flaws in this secular relativistic worldview in a microcosm when we reflect on the words of Vice President Kamala Harris that she uttered this past September in response to the statement of a college student at George Mason University. The student claimed that that Israel was engaged in ethnic genocide of the Palestinians, stating that the genocide was similar to the ethnic genocide she claimed was part of America's past. The student concluded that America today was engaged in genocide by sending funds to Israel. The vice president did not dispute the student's claims. Rather, Ms. Harris applauded the student for speaking, quote, her truth, end quote, and offering, quote, her perspective, end quote. We need to dissect Ms. Harris' response to understand the dramatic falsehoods on which she bases the response. Vice President Kamala Harris's vacuous intellect poured forth the greatest of lies, that the cosmos has no truth, and that therefore, logically, the student's statements were irrelevant unless she, at some point, accumulated power. Ms. Harris did not endeavor to challenge the student's assertion regarding Israel at all. She did not seek to reason by engaging logic and facts to articulate the basis for a contrary opinion that Israel's actions were one of self-preservation, not genocide. Nor did the vice president address that of all modern peoples, the people of Israel have faced genocide more than any other. Facts and history were irrelevant, the vice president believes, to the student's version of truth. In doing so, the vice president did not address the student's concerns at all. The student was concerned, despite a falsely held belief about the facts, that the United States sending money to Israel was supporting genocide, a concern Ms. Harris utterly refused to address. Instead, Ms. Harris stated, quote, and again, she said, this is about the fact that your voice, your perspective, your experience, your truth should not be suppressed, and it must be heard, right? End quote. It's as if an adolescent child approached their parent stating, I haven't eaten in 2 days. I'm fearful I shall starve. And instead of the parent addressing the concern by explaining how and when the family shall eat and why they haven't eaten, the parent applauds the child for having her stomach growl. The vice president demonstrated contempt for the student by not responding with reason or logic, and in doing so expressed her own worship of democracy as her God. She effectively stated that genocide, as the student sees it, was okay unless and until that student gained a majority in the United States. And then she can stop sending aid to Israel and stop genocide. Remarkable. Reason and logic, according to the vice president, would suppress the student's truth rather than empower the student to see the truth. In other words, Vice President Harris expressed indifference to the student while falsely claiming she was being tolerant to that very student. The culture fostered by the vice president would argue that our highest calling to one another in civil society is tolerance. and that she demonstrated tolerance to the student. But she instead expressed indifference. For Vice President Harris holds a position of power granted to her by citizens, such as this student, and the student was speaking to conduct of her government and questioning her government's conduct. Instead of addressing the issue, Mrs. Harris offered a paternalistic sacrifice on the throne of democracy, effectively telling the student her truth has no power unless she gains the majority and gets elected. I witnessed this death of reason while serving in the Kansas House of Representatives. Many of my colleagues had concluded that democracy was inherently virtuous. In other words, if they gain power, however they may gain the power, in a nation with democratic processes, their actions, therefore, are and will and should be considered virtuous, regardless of what conduct they engage in. Virtue, therefore, was not defined by any adherence to right or avoiding that which is wrong. Rather, virtue was gained merely by winning an election. My worldview, on the other hand, believes that there are absolute truths to which we aspire, and that right and wrong are knowable. And in fact, much of our passion in life comes from the desire to know and live truth. These two worldviews, one which rejects any absolutes and one which acknowledges an author of truth, clashed in January 1994 on the floor of the Kansas House of Representatives as I served as a state representative. A colleague of mine had introduced a bill to make it a crime to, quote, lie, end quote, about any incumbent legislators or government official. The proposal chilled me to the bone. Government having jurisdiction to determine what is true and what is a lie? Those in power having the authority and the ability to render our speech a crime? The bill would grant government the power to create ideological crimes, the ideological crime of speaking against power. We see that today, do we not? Our government acting against thought and speech to create ideological conformity, such intolerance in the name of tolerance. I remember objecting to the bill, explaining that the legislation violated the First Amendment of our Constitution, to which my colleague admonished me, Mr. Klein, can't you just forget about the Constitution for once? I replied that her challenge to me is so revealing of her position and so appropriate. I said, I suppose it makes perfect sense that a person who believes they have the authority to define what is true can reject all previous truths articulated if those truths become inconvenient, such as what is reflected in our Constitution. My response was met with silent disdain. Now, you might think that as one who believes in absolute truth, that I would support government requiring all persons to speak the absolute truth. I do not, unless it's in a court hearing. But for I don't believe humankind is the author of truth. Rather, God is the author of truth. And so I do not look to government institutions to help me understand the meaning of life nor of truth. I do not have the vanity to believe I created the laws of physics nor shaped the human being in the womb. And I must confess, I also don't believe you hold such power. Do believe, however, that our God formed purpose out of chaos by speaking truth into the darkness, and that in his love, he offers grace as we search out an understanding of that truth in our lives. In other words, we all make mistakes as we search for truth, and that despite our mistakes, God continues through his grace to afford us that freedom. And in that freedom that he affords, we learn from those mistakes and grow and come to know that truth and know God more fully. You see, I worship a big G God of truth and grace, and not the small g God of government or man, the God of fates or arbitrariness. And herein lies the battle. My colleague believed government was the final arbiter of truth. Therefore, if one was in government, you could proclaim your own truth and thereby declare the speech of another as a lie. And that is why she believed it was right for incumbents, those who held the power of government, to proclaim their thoughts to be true and others' thoughts to be lies. Kamala Harris was effectively saying the same thing to the student at George Mason University when she told the student, you can have your own truth, that the United States supports genocide of Palestinians, but that small t truth held no power to stop genocide unless you achieve a majority, thus showing indifference to the student's thoughts and indifference to genocide if it was actually occurring. Words without moral purpose hold no power. One with a Christian worldview, one who believed the truth that all individuals have value and which held the student in respect, would have answered with the truth that Israel's actions towards Palestine are not genocidal. Or if genocide was factually occurring, a person who believed in truth would certainly pledge to act to prevent such genocide, because genocide is wrong. By not doing so, Kamala Harris acknowledged genocide is not a basis on which she measures appropriate government conduct, thus denying the truth about the value of the student and denying the truth that genocide is evil. In Ms. Harris's world, all truth is lost. Worshiping democracy is merely setting the stage for two wolves and a sheep to join together for dinner. The sheep will always get eaten. In a world where democracy is the author of truth, the individual has no power, for two is always greater than one. In a utilitarian world, the power of one is lost and the individual dies in the face of the brutal truth of non-caring mathematics. Surely, the American Republic stands for more than a mere showing of hands. In fact, as I mentioned in our last broadcast, we have the most anti-democratic document in world history called the Bill of Rights. If one person says, I'm going to speak, they have that right despite if 330 million disagree. If one person wants to worship, they have that right despite if 330 million disagree. Yet the Bill of Rights is so fragile. The parchment on which it's written on would crumble in your hands if it was exposed to oxygen. And it's kept in the vault in the National Archives. If you held that document in front of you, it would not stop a bullet. It would not prevent harm. The power of those words in that document are only present to protect you if the truth reflected in the words resonate in the heart of a people. And so when the rule of law, which without truth is mere words on paper, no longer reflect the truth, they lose purpose and you lose faith and you become the victims of fate. I'm Phill Klein. Join us on First Principles next time as we continue this dialogue about the core foundations, first principles of our governance, great divine truths that were gifted to a flawed people. All of us have fallen short of the glory of God, yet God continues to grace us with the presence of his truth. And it is in the recognition that all persons, every individual, has value. It's in that recognition that we gave birth on this continent a new nation. And it's that new nation that has struggled in all of its flaws to come to the full understanding of what the words mean. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all persons are created equal. And we still are engaged in that struggle. But if we disregard truth, we lose all individual liberty. And it becomes a game of might makes right. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer's admonition and warning to us sings clearly today through the years. First they came for, he said, the Unionists and the Communists, and I was not one. So I did not raise my voice. Then they came for, as he's speaking in Nazi Germany. For those of different ethnic backgrounds, they came for the homosexuals. I was not one, so I did not raise voice. And then he states, and when they came for me, there was no one left to speak. This great promise of truth to this nation about the value of each and every individual rejects cancel culture, rejects identity politics, and gives us the courage to stand for the freedom of even those with whom we disagree. And if we refuse to do so, if we refuse to stand, if we refuse to give voice to those who are being canceled, we shall in turn be canceled, and the great gift of America will be lost to the world. Join us next time.